Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Act in Context reboot. I'm Tim Gordon.
And I'm Joanne Steinwalks.
And we are joined by our friend and colleague, Glenn Callaghan. This is a hell of a booking that we got, Joanne. This is really cool.
I know, right? I'm so excited.
Would you, thank you. Thanks, Glenn. Joanne, would you be willing to introduce a little bit about Glenn? Because I'm a big fan of the early FAP work that you had done, Glenn. Yeah. It's been really influential in my world, but I know that you know Glenn a little more personally, Joanne.
Yeah. I don't think I'm going to talk about all of the academic stuff. We can talk about that in our conversation. There's a fair amount of it, and it's pretty impressive. But Glenn said something to me, or I read it. No, I think he said it to me. We were talking about clinical work, and I just really liked what he said. He said, functional analysis ends when the client walks out of the room for the last time.
That's beautiful.
Right? Isn't that fabulous? And I have said that to my clients, my colleagues, my students, my consultees, my supervisees over and over and over again. Because just holding that idea in your head transforms clinical work, I think.
Say it again.
Functional analysis ends when the client walks out of the room for the last time.
I love it.
Okay. You remember saying that, Glenn?
No.
Oh.
No, but I would love if I did.
You did. You actually did. You actually said this. Right. And I thought, Glenn Callaghan's a genius.
Oh, I like that too.
Yeah, I know. But just that idea that, that I think that just totally informs how you see the world and how you do the work. And I think perhaps some of the struggles you're having with the way things have moved in the FAP community and even in the ACT community to some extent.
Yeah, for sure. The challenge, I think, well, there are several challenges with FAP, including the name, but certainly one of them is that it has struggled with for years and ultimately moved away from functional assessment or functional analysis. And so, which makes sense. And we can talk about that if it's useful to talk about why I think that's happened, what the goals with dissemination were. But the challenge, I think, really was that, if that's the case, that our job in conducting an iterative functional assessment or functional analysis over time doesn't end until we're done. Mm-mm. If that's true, which I think it is, then it would be fundamentally part of the therapy. And the drag is, I don't know that that's there in at least one version of FAP as it's being done.
I don't think it's there in most therapeutic interactions. Yeah. I mean, I see a lot of my consultees and students and people I do that with are very caught up in, having the treatment plan. This is the thing. This is the goal. And it stays very static and very stable. And I think most people that I know and work with really aren't trained to do a functional analysis.
Well, that I think is the rub, and I don't want to get too esoteric too quickly, but it's probably useful to define a couple of terms. One is, functional analysis proper, as I understand it, is the sort of identifying the key controlling variables that would impact in our work client behavior. Antecedents, the behavior of interest, understood functionally in terms of what it does and the consequences that follow. And we can add motivational or establishing operations to that too pretty easily. Mm-hmm. And then empirically, you demonstrate that was true, right? So the real functional analysis is the proof is in the pudding and you're constantly moving on that analysis. The functional assessment is sort of a step down and language that I'm using more and more because the reality is we cast the variables as we see them and then we move globally around them. And humans are too damn complicated to do a full-blown, I think, functional analysis for the kind of work we do in clinical behavior analysis or ideally third-wave behavioral therapies versus something like a really targeted behavior with autism which is they really do the best, most pure functional analysis where you identify the behavior and move really hard on that. And you can demonstrate and this is single case designs, this is tracking data really carefully. And so it's okay, I think, if we back up a little bit and say, well, what if it was a functional assessment? But that would still be the same thing. It's just minus the really kick-ass behavioral observations for all targeted behaviors, right? So you start with a concept like
of it.
Right.
Yeah.
You start with a concept like depression, and the reality is there's probably like 25 things going on with an individual, and we pick the top 3, and then we kind of move on those and see if globally they've moved. And I think you're right. The drag is doing that isn't really taught much. Most graduate programs aren't decidedly behavioral. They're cognitive behavioral, which is fine. But the key part of the behavioral work is really the functional assessment. The upside of that, I think, if people were ever open to it and they said, this is the thing my client's doing, this is the immediate consequence I think it has. Here's the longer term consequence, which is usually different, right? The escape consequence is usually more immediate. The longer.
I want to pause you for just a second. I think it'd be really, really helpful for our audience for us to do some clinical examples later on. Maybe really literally walk through a case. That'd be really cool. Okay.
Yeah. No, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Anyway, so if they did that, the upside is you get this incredibly tailored assessment to an individual. The downside is every individual is unique, and so it isn't a technology that you just put on. And so I think ACT and FAP have, in some places, not with all practitioners for sure, moved towards much more of a technology or a technique application rather than functional assessment. And FAP made the decision to do that years ago, which I remember having an argument with one of the key stakeholders saying, you can't do it because it's in the title. you can't take away functional analysis. It's in the title. And the person said, that's all right. Yeah. So
why do you think that happened? Why do you think that ACT, I think, made a similar decision to use second level terms rather than the super geeky terms, just in terms of people. Steve talks about it, people's brains turn off when you start to use really technical behavioral language.
Right.
Do you think that was similar for FAP, that they wanted the work to get out there, even in a more dilute form?
So my memory of the decision around FAP, and this is just my memory when I sit around the table with the creators of it, and there was an active decision to move towards what ACT was becoming, and it was really in the name of dissemination. And the two challenges with behavior analysis are that first, people don't know it as readily. Like if we just talk about cognitions, like the reality is those exist in a lay language, right? So you're going to change your thought, like I change my thoughts all the time, right? So that would be super easy to disseminate cognition. I imagine, maybe Freud had this problem early on when he's talking about crazy stuff that he made up. It's psychosexual. They're like, what are you talking about?
Psycho what?
Yeah, exactly. Although the second half is like, woo, spicy. And so maybe that helped. That's interesting, because the second part of it then, I think, is that because behaviorism has its own valence and grew up, in clinical work, it grew up as a little bit overly mechanistic, a little bit dispassionate. I don't know, and you have Watson saying things like, give me any child and I'll create the doctor, lawyer, don't say that stuff out loud, even if it's theoretically true, which it isn't, because you don't have access to all the variables, but it is theoretically true. So then you use language like reinforcement, and people turn off because that's, my client is not a robot or a machine. Like, of course it's not. This is a precision of language. But I think so you have the decision to move FAP away from this stuff because the valence of the language, and my guess is Steve would say this true, the derived relations of the language to the audience, to the listener, are too aversive.
Yeah.
And so moving to mid-level terms makes a lot of sense. And then the problem with FAP that ACT just didn't have, I don't think, and I've thought a lot about this, and I think this is correct, is that ACT never really required an idiographic analysis, and FAP inherently just does.
Can you say what an idiographic analysis
so
is?
It's just tailored to the individual, sorry. So idiographic means highly specified to that one individual. So what hooks you into a relationship is gonna be different than what hooks me into a relationship, right? And would maintain that. I think that you and I struggle with thoughts. How we struggle may be slightly different, but I would guess that the core of what ACT pointed out was probably pretty dead on, which is good, right? Which is we struggle with, Buddhists would say, clinging and aversion and kind of greed, right? And then the ACT people kind of moved that, or developed that concept in tandem or whatever, but I think moved Eastern philosophy into what we struggle with is the incredibly aversive nature of the relationship of a thought to the natural feeling that it evokes, and so we want to escape it. And I think that's universal. And I think it's universal that we want to connect, but this species has become so complicated that how we connect, because the how is culturally driven, right? It's driven by that level of analysis, not just the species, I would argue, has the need to connect. How we connect has to be understood really individually, and it's driven out by these horribly complicated histories of trauma and abuse and joy.
But also, it's also driven out by different physiologies too. You know,
I think that's true, and that would be true for both levels, right? For both the ACT and the FAP, that how our sympathetic nervous systems are wound, how we're built. But I think it would then feed into that in terms of how quickly I would respond to aversion.
And what you might interpret as aversion, your sensitivity.
Right, which is deeply embedded in a very complicated cultural understanding or experience. So I think, so my memory was, we sat around this table and they said, we want FAP to move this way. And I said, you can't do that without the will of the people. And I would say, I don't think you want to do that. It's going to turn into a technology. You will lose all of the functional assessment. But the reality is, I don't know how disseminable, I don't know what the word is. It is when you hold on to an idiographic analysis. It doesn't work in the broader context of the way science is done.
There's no handouts for that.
No, there's not. And I've tried to cook versions up. And I think there's a core. Like there's the easy FAP in the room. So I should say this too. So because my differences are so big with FAP now, and there's stuff going on that we can talk about that really creates situations that are, I think, unarguably unethical, right? Because that's happened, I no longer really describe the work I do as FAP. So this is terrible because it's just a rebranding, but I think, it's a deliberate, this is idiographic or individually tailored, functional assessment driven. So I just call it interpersonal behavior therapy. And the idea, ultimately the idea is that we will let go of all of these terms soon enough, that the fourth wave that's coming, I really believe this, I hope I see it in my lifetime, the fourth wave that's coming is we are either behavior therapist or clinical behavior analyst or whatever we end up calling it. Contextual behavioral scientist is fine. That these are contextual behavioral interventions, and we choose from what now is a really rich palette, right? CBT is dead on great for people who fundamentally believe their cognitions drive them. I love it. It's so easy. It's kind of boring, but it's so easy. Right? I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's just...
I know what you're saying. I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
And I use that stuff with certain clients. Like, wouldn't it be true? We use it with our kids because it's how they think, right? What if you thought this instead? They're like, oh, that's fascinating, right? So at cognitive intervention, ACT for, rather than changing the cognitions, developing a repertoire of acceptance, the interpersonal behavioral work around becoming more connected. And then what DBT and I think a variety of the other kind of third wave therapies offer are very specific applications to particular problems that humans absolutely develop. And so that idea, so I just wanted to say that aside, like, one, I don't think the terms matter. except where they evoke really problematic interventions. And then, so the language that I might use is interpersonal behavior therapy.
I like
this
that.
Is a really cool conversation, I think, especially for our listeners who might not be who might be newer to ACT or FAT, Functional Analytic Psychotherapy, or to DBT or to compassion focused therapy, because I think that it requires a cultural shift in order to start learning this behavioral work and to get unstuck from maybe some of your own stories that you have about what behaviorism is, kind of like what you were talking about earlier with Watson, or even talking about Skinner and some of that work. But I love this idea of just like straight up being able to have conversations with clinicians saying like, hey, maybe we've been sold on a lie. Like this idea that, worksheets and these one size fit all kind of metaphors and interventions and mimicking things that you might read in a self-help book or in a very
or go to a training and watch the trainer do something, right? Yeah,
absolutely. That might not actually be workable. That might not be functional in your therapy office in the work that you're doing, and that we could actually empower people to be more in the moment with their clients, more creative and more flexible themselves to serve their clients and to do good work.
And I think that's hard to sell. I'm totally with you. It's what I would want, Tim.
We do not have a sexy product here, Glenn.
It's not. It's not that enticing because I think what drives us as clinicians into the work we do, is to understand the person and to help them. I think we derive a lot of meaning from that, and it makes us feel really good. And the challenge is that what we would want to sell is we can give you a framework to understand all of your clients. And from within that framework, you can move in these really cool different directions of affect regulation and tolerance to the ability to actually sit with unbelievably hard experiences. For the work I focused on the most is to creating much more intense, connected relationships that are very fulfilling.
And transformative.
Yeah, massively.
Hugely transformative, yeah. Exactly.
And especially, where I'm at in life now, because I've always been deeply interested in Buddhism and its translation into the West and mindfulness practice, is both of those always. So that if we're having an interaction and it's really difficult, and I notice something coming up for me, that I can not only not react really quickly to that, if possible, because I still absolutely mess this stuff up, but in the moment, if I can just notice that, like, wow, this is really hard, or, I'm feeling really, really whatever, or even joy, and the vulnerability that comes with joy of like, am I going to be really goofy when I do this? And then to actually share that whole thing with you in a way that's workable.
Yeah.
And so
it sounds so simple to say,
right?
But literally, that is what we're trying to do, and this is what you teach and I teach. I'm pretty sure, Tim, you teach it, and it's very difficult to. You have to teach it by example. You can't point to it. It's fingers pointing at the moon.
Right. It's super difficult, and so I think that certainly watching someone in a workshop is really helpful. The challenge is when we try to reverse engineer ourselves into that, which we can't be that. No. Because the like we're saying, the sort of the function or the way that works in that moment with that person is based on that person's history and knowing how they respond to others, right? So
I would add to it too, Glenn, when you're watching an interaction, when you're watching some sort of demonstration in a workshop, you're actually not watching therapy.
Right.
You're watching a demonstration in a workshop, which is fundamentally different.
This actually even comes up when I'm doing consultation or supervision with somebody, and they'll say, let's do this role play, or here's what the client would say, and then I will say something that I would actually even say, it sounds pretty good. It sounds pretty good in the moment, and they're like, "Gosh, how do you do that?" And I have to remind them and me, I'm not in the room with the client.
Right.
I'm not responsible for how this goes in the moment, And so, and half the time they're serving up something pretty straightforward. So that's not going to be where I'm stuck. I get stuck in the room around stuff that I don't understand. Yeah, so it is more of a demonstration of what could happen. And the challenge is, I think, when we watch, that's how we want to learn, right? So that's what I would do, rather than what I've learned to do teaching this interpersonal behavioral work is to really remind the therapist, like, what we're teaching the client is what you have to learn. You do, yes, and you watch and you try again.
Yes.
You have to watch to see what you did, to see if it had the impact that you had hoped it would. And sometimes that's immediate, and sometimes you have to hold that sort of over here to the side to watch to see what's about to roll out, because the client may adjust slightly and then come right back into the problem. Yeah.
The rebound. The rebound of habit.
Yeah, because it's a well-learned behavior, right?
Absolutely.
And so we do, well, basically you watch because you figured out, like, that's the assessment, and then you do something.
Can you give a clinical example right now? Do you think you could do that? Yeah.
That would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Sure. Let me think of a good kind of client. And so this will all be disguised, so there's no identifying information and stuff. Yeah.
Sort of a generalized.
We appreciate that.
Clienting.
Right. So let's say I have a client who struggles, I don't think they do now, but this is something, a particular client struggled immensely with interpersonal connection and vulnerability, so that this client would only have relationships that were intensely sexual, and would, as they developed into a more kind of real relationship that involved a lot broader repertoire, the client would bail out kind of instantly. So the job there then is, it's probably at least twofold, but the main piece is to help the client develop a skill set that would allow them to connect in multiple ways that were not sexually driven.
But also, you've created a context where what they know how to do cannot work. There's no option for sexualizing the relationship. They may try, but there's no follow through with that.
There cannot.
They're constantly, if they're going to stay in relationship with you, they have to learn to do something different.
Right, which points out a risk, I think, of FAP more than almost any therapy I've ever been around, that the intensity and the intimacy that shows up in the room makes it just about the most fertile ground for unethical behavior that I've ever seen. There may be other types of psychotherapy outside of behaviorism that do this, but I don't think
psychoanalysis for sure.
Yeah, I think that it could. Yeah, right. Anyway, so we can revisit that that topic. So my job with the client then is to model and create opportunities to reinforce their ability to more effectively connect with me with a broad repertoire, right? And so that's easier said than done, right? So that's a big old fat target of, like, the person needs to be able to disclose more effectively, identify, this is kind of how I organize the world, kind of identify their own needs and values and assert those, as can occur in therapy, which has pretty tight parameters, but for sure out in the world.
And that right there makes perfect sense, by the way. Yeah. Like, that seems like something that you could get the client to pay attention to and get them to track.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. So even if we targeted that, and let's say that part of this client's intimacy needs were being able to more effectively say, when I'm feeling this, I need you to do this instead, or, something like that. Or to identify that feeling in general of, like, I feel like I need to connect. Maybe we shouldn't just go have a lot of sex and I can just tell you how I feel, or something like that, right? And so our job in the room is to have the client practice that.
How did you do that with this client? Can you specifically give us an example of, they did their bid, they did their repertoire, their sexualized sort of repertoire, and you responded.
Yeah, with this client, it wasn't as intense. I can talk about clients both that I have not responded well to when they've been overtly sexual, and in clients that I learned to respond more effectively. In this case, this is the client that I'm thinking of would really have somewhat of a sense of a difficulty, a pain, a feeling that she wanted to share. And then my job is to first, and this is very behavioral, like discriminate and then respond, right? So what are you feeling? Okay, so we'd sort of shape that up into language that made sense, knowing that the goal ultimately is to get her to do all of this outside without me, right? And so I would say, what's going on right now? Can you give it a name? So lots of therapy does this, right? Can you name if it had a color, if it lived somewhere in your body, all of that. And then the key is, for me, when you sit with that feeling, do you need something from me?
Oh, beautiful.
There's something I could do for you.
That's so lovely.
Yeah, well, and that's like, it's
because
really,
when we talk about sitting with the feeling, it's you sit with the feeling,
right?
And there's what do you want me to do with you while you sit with the feeling?
How can I help?
That's so.
What would be useful?
Yeah, that's a very elegant intervention right there.
Yeah,
that's awesome. I'm going to talk to you guys the rest of my life because it's
you liar. You will not.
No, I do. I like this though.
You're such a moving target. There's no.
I like I know I'm a horrible person. I like hearing that what I do sounds good though. So anyway, so the idea is, clients aren't going to know how to do this stuff.
No,
right?
Of course not.
And so the client's just going to stare back like, I don't know. And so then I get to say, and this is one of when I was taught this kind of therapy by Bill Follett at University of Nevada, you use these tricks like, well, what don't you know? You just get them talking to try to stumble in.
I love that.
And then we kind of have this knob that is really high on, that's great, to it starts to turn down as the repertoire takes hold of, I don't need to celebrate it as much. You already know how to do that. Let's keep advancing it down the line, right? So the metaphor I think of is if my son's learning to hit a baseball, I don't mean to make it sexist. Hope didn't play baseball. Actually, she played softball. So if I'm trying to get Hope to hit a softball, the very first behavior is just approaching the plate as someone is throwing something very hard at you, right? And so that's awesome that you got in that box. That's a scary place to be, especially when a child is throwing.
Yeah, good for you for stepping up.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but then the next couple times they do that, you're like, you know how to step in the box.
Come on.
Right. You know how to do that. And so with the client, if the client says, I just don't know, then I might try to prompt, like, what don't you know? Is it that you don't know? Or the client may say, I don't know how to get your help. And that's huge the first time around.
Yeah.
Second time around, I may say, can you tell me that you need something, but you don't know what it is? And that's like 50 yards down the field to me. Like, because
I say to clients, is it that you literally do not know when you look inside, there's nothing there, or you do know and you don't know how to tell me?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the first is a discrimination issue. Like, is it that there's something there and it's just so hard to name because it was either punished when you tried to name it or no one ever bothered trying to shape that in you, which is totally our history as people.
For sure.
And then if it is there, but the worry is, if I share this with you, you will hurt me. You will shut it down. I will be too vulnerable or anything, right? So there's a little bit of the act stuff. Yeah. Any of that stuff that would make this something I can't do. And this is a client who had a history of trying to share things and being shut down pretty heavily by parents. And it's a pretty rich history. And so if the client then can say that, I think that's just amazing. That she says, well, it's not amazing because I don't know. But it's amazing that you can tell me that you need something even if you don't know what it is. And so now I want to figure it out, right? So there's a lot of leaning in and a lot of big heart in the room. And then we're continually, like, successive approximation, trying to shape that up so that the next, time down the line when it looks like you're feeling something, what could you do right now? And that may take another prompt the first few times of, I don't know, what are you asking? Like, could I be here for you in some way that would be helpful to you?
Do you also find, Glenn, that there are certain categories of emotion that actually you have to restart the process? Like if anger shows up, or fear, or, any of those, you have to kind of re-begin.
Oh, absolutely. And some of that is, and I may be misreading the question, but some of that is deciding sometimes what work here is going to be fundamental to move this connecting process. Is it going to be like, what is it like to sit with anger?
Mm-hmm.
Can we do that? And I just like, what I want you to know is I'm here with you, and it's okay to feel this. And I'll joke with them. I'm very playful in therapy. So I'm like, if you're feeling like getting up and hitting me really hard, that's kind of not okay, right? So it diffuses that a little bit. But can we sit in this moment where you're really angry and it's okay? And now can you, with that, do what you need to do with me? So it's always that. It's so my wife Jen Gregg and I wrote a paper years ago with Brian Marks and Barbara Kohlenberg and probably someone else who I'm forgetting, I apologize, on the idea of doing FAP and ACT work at the same time. And one becomes the context for the other. And that was a really interesting discussion to have until sort of ultimately you move out and you say, it doesn't really matter. It's just a repertoire that you're gonna target one in front of the other, no matter what the repertoire is. And so in this case, if there's a huge amount of anger, there may be rebooting or restarting simply to be able to say, like, there's a huge amount in the room right now. Can we get this to a place where we both feel comfortable, but you feel in a space to then move with what you need?
And it's so complex what you're asking them to do. There's calibration, there's attending, there's acceptance. I mean, just asking that is a hugely complex thing.
Yeah.
Well, and if they can do any part of that, it's extraordinary.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And so this is the part, and for the two of you, if you do this interpersonal work, I imagine, well, I know you do, if when you do this interpersonal work, like part of the cool bit of this is that you just get to celebrate how awesome it is that they're trying it.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And they're not doing it perfectly well. And you're this version that they've got in their head that doesn't mess up and, leave the toilet seat up or whatever it is, right? That you do everything well. And of course we don't, but you get to watch this person who really is struggling. And then they're trying to do this unbelievably complicated thing of not just getting up and saying, F off, I'm out. And you just watch this sort of or profound sadness.
Yeah.
And they still sit. And he says, this is just amazing to experience this with you. And this isn't where I want you to live. I don't want you to have sadness all the time. Right. But that you can sit with me with this. Like, this is not to be overly cheesy, but like, this is really pretty special.
Yeah. Do you ever negotiate with people? Like, could we sit with it for like 1 beat, 1 second?
Oh, sure.
And then let's go. Let's go. Yeah. We're done. Come on, let's move on.
Well, that's it. Because if it's too aversive, this would be true for ACT. It's certainly true for the interpersonal stuff. Like, you don't respond to every problem every time it happens because it's too damn aversive, right? It's aversive for us in our lives. It
can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
It is overwhelming, right? I used to sort of do sessions and still do sometimes once in a while. Like, they take as long as they take. But then what I realized was an hour-and-a-half session is just exhausting for some people if it's really good work.
Yeah.
And so like keeping parameters and being thoughtful about how often you respond. And I agree, Joanne. Like, so if the person's really struggling and you're like, okay, you had that, it'll come back around. It's okay. You just had it for a minute. There's tons of thoughts going through about sort of how that moment is. Yeah.
Let me pause for a second. I really love the tone of the conversation that we're having right now. And love it so much that it's validating to me as a therapist. And even I feel like if my clients were listening to this, this would be validating to them, because I have clients who will say to me things like, Tim, my friends go to therapy and they leave and they feel like $1 million. When I leave, I need to have a nap. The rest of my day is a write-off, right? But what I like about this is that we're talking about doing really good work in the moment. Like, we're companions with our clients on that journey, doing the work in the session. We're not talking about things that are happening outside of their world. Exactly. Like my favorite example that I like to use with my clients is, if I'm having some difficulty with my brother-in-law, who's a real jerk, I don't want to come into session with you and just talk to you about how my brother-in-law is a jerk and co-opt you into being like, he really is a jerk, Tim. Right. I want you to help me like show up to that frustration and figure out who I want to be in the presence of that frustration and learn like real talk to be the person I want to be. And this is so good. Like, this is juicy work. This is good stuff. And I love just hearing this.
Well, that's awesome. And I think what you're pointing out is actually something that took me way too long to learn, is that clients just need different things.
Yes.
And there are clients sometimes that just want a space to complain. And I'll do that a little, but it gets a little bit boring, and it's not what I'm good at. Right. Like all of us can listen and sort of be the receptacle to their problems or whatever. But like what I'm good at and what engages me is having them live this bigger life, right? Mm-hmm. If what they've done is come in and say, this is what I want, and they say something like, I want to have a more fulfilling set of relationships, or I want to be the person that I think I could be, I'm super in. Yeah. If they don't say that,
I'm really interested in something you just said. Clients come and say what they want. I rarely have that experience. Right. I get a lot of what I don't want.
Right. Well, and so I think that's the other side then. So then we offer that. So if they say, I'm just having all these problems, what I'll say, and I should be super upfront. Like, I'm not a full-time clinician. I'm a professor. And so I see a client at a time at this point in my life. Mm-hmm. They seek me, which is sort of delightful, but this is not how I draw income. And so there's, I do consultation with people who do this for a living, and there's a ton of different kinds of clients that you see and things like that.
Yeah.
So, but I'll say, this is what I do from what you've described.
Thank you for making that distinction. A lot of people who are talking like this, they don't tell people. I see one client at a time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Do you know? And
I used to see lots and lots of clients. So but yeah.
And it's very different, isn't it?
Oh my gosh.
Right.
Yeah. And like, I blah, blah, blah. I love talking, right? So I'm a teacher and a researcher by trade. And, but of course the clinical work is super engaging and keeps how I think about this very much alive.
So you said when people come in and they're telling you what you don't want, you say.
So what I tell them is, here's what I'm good at, or what I specialize in. And I don't mean that in a grandiose way, but this is what I do. I help people learn to sit with or experience really difficult feelings. And rather than react to them really quickly and strongly, try to make a decision as much as they can in the moment of what to do with those. And I do that in the context of them creating much more fulfilling relationships, to live the life you really want to live, right? That kind of language. And as much as we can. Yeah. And so, and I'll tell clients straight up, like, so we can talk about this, and you may decide, like, that's a lot of work, or I don't want to do that. And I would totally understand.
Did I ever tell you the story about the marketing professional who came into my practice?
No.
So she comes in and I give her my shtick, right? She said, so let me get this straight. If I do what I've already done, I'm going to get what I've always gotten. And if I do what you say, I may or may not have a better life, but I could try. Yeah. Basically. And I said, yeah, sort of. She said, you really do not have a sexy product here.
Right.
Isn't it fabulous?
None of them are, though. Like, you think about that, like all that marketing stuff for anything. Like, you could use this toothpaste and probably it'll help you prevent cavities, but it might not. And you might really have shitty teeth. Sorry for the language, but but that crest wouldn't sell. No, it fights cavities actively, right? Yeah. So you could do this work with me. And the reality is we could work super hard and it could be really painful and you don't really move that far down the field. And there may be someone better for you. It's about match.
So I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here, and this is, I'm worried is going to make me seem super unprofessional. No. But like, I like to goof around. I like to like, a part of my use of self is to be like the real, authentic me and to joke. Yeah. So sometimes in session, like with my clients, like this phenomenon that you're talking about, Joanne, because I experience this, right? Like my full-time gig, how I make a living is through seeing clients. And I oftentimes find, and it's not just with mandated folks, that it's an eliminative agenda. Like, you need to help me not feel this. My brother-in-law is a jerk, and we need to, I just want to complain about him. And I'll sometimes try to interrupt.
I'd rather complain about him with you than get into a fist fight and go to jail this weekend.
Totally.
Yeah.
Which is good.
Yeah, which could be workable. I get that. Yeah. And so sometimes, like, one of the really corny things that I'll do, and maybe I'm just seeking some validation from you two, is like, I'll even be like, well, I'm going to quote like some really great philosophers here. I don't know if you're familiar with the Spice Girls, but they have this great, this great self-inquiry. Awesome. Like, tell me what you want, what you really, really want.
What you really, not just really, but really, really want.
Oh, I love that.
That's awesome.
You know what I mean? But like, what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to be a goof and kind of interrupt them and look for this more. I mean, we could talk about motivative augmentals. We could talk about, if we want to use a mid-level term, values. But I'm really trying to just interrupt that cycle of, I'm going to come in here and this is the context where now I'm going to just dump on you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you too?
It does. I don't know, Joan, if you have thoughts. Like, is it right if I say, or do you want to say?
Go ahead. You'll probably say something really good, and I'll go, yeah, like that.
No. So what I would say is, so I'm very, very playful in the room. Mm-hmm. And I think, and I can tell a story about why I think that's good. And I don't lose, again, one client at a time, but I don't lose them for this.
No.
That's important. Yeah.
Is, I'll be playful and watch what it does, and sometimes say, does it make sense why I did that?
Mm-hmm. Or how does that land for you, what I just did?
Yeah. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. And it feels very genuine for me to do that. It's who I am. Not everybody is silly. And so it feels, and this is the kind of, set of clients I see, so if I'm working in behavioral oncology, that's going to be much more, focused probably if and when I ever did that. So in this case, like, I think this part of the story I tell is I'm modeling for them a genuine sort of awkward human relationship. But I'm trying to be very mindful about not doing it at the wrong time, because the reality is I know enough. The functional assessment of me is I will diffuse painful, difficult situations with humor.
With humor.
And there are times to do it.
Yeah.
I do believe this in the world. But it has to be thoughtful in therapy. And so if I do that, there is a chance I'm going to mess it up. And I have. And when I teach, even to undergraduates, when I teach them, I'll say, do you want to hear a story about how I mess something up? And they like those stories. Because I tell them a bunch of things that go okay too. And I have been so engaged with clients and leaned back and just been so like, that is really great. Like, so my I don't know if it's ontological, but my meta philosophy is life is effed up and beautiful, always the same time.
Always at the same time.
And so there is an odd humor in our suffering. I don't have it about my own. Most people don't. But sometimes I can
see odd humor. You don't have it about your suffering? You don't have your own humor about your own suffering.
Yeah, in the moment.
Yeah, it's very serious.
I do.
It's very, very serious, yeah.
Yeah, but when it's like this, I don't see.
Yeah.
Anyway, so there have been clients when I've sort of made a tease or said something playful, and it did not land.
It did not go, yeah.
And the key, I think, the best is, if we're going to be genuine, is to be very willing to watch how it lands. Mm-hmm. How did that?
When I was first learning ACT, I was using some of that, sort of diffusion and with humor around the repertoire, And I literally lost a client because he experienced me as laughing at him.
Yeah.
He just literally could not hear it in any other way. And I'd been working with this guy for a while. It was devastating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that sort of that need to be, very precise, very sensitive to what's going on here,
It's so hard.
I was basically doing the technology. That's what I was doing.
Well, and even if that were true, but what emerged for you was who you are, which my experience of you, Joanne, is very playful, right? It's what draws me to talking with you, is if you were then in that moment quite genuine and playful, that it just was too much for that person in that moment. And so I had a situation like that where a client was, I think the term that we use is like a pathological liar. She was self-identified. Like, I lie too much. It's costing me all these relationships. And so, like, that's fascinating clinically. Like, why would you do that? And you know it, but you can't stop it. And so, we sort of assessed around that and looked at the targets and what can we move. And so in the room, tons of stuff, right? What does it feel like right now to be this vulnerable with me? Or what's going on? Do you, I feel like when she would be honest, like, I see that this is hard for you, but this is my language, it's very natural language, stoked to be in the room with you.
Yeah.
I just see you showing up and you don't want to, and that's amazing. Anyway, this is like 5 or 6 sessions in, we're kicking some serious butt. Things are moving outside, right? Because the goal is always, look, try this outside. It's
generalize, get it out of the session. Yeah.
And to always remind them it will look different than with me. Always different. Your job is to try it, watch it, try it again.
Yeah.
She's trying things in her family. Things are moving differently. She comes into one of the sessions, and again, this isn't like first couple of sessions. She comes into the session, and she starts spinning this bullshit like you can't believe. Like, it's just horrible. And I smile and lean back, and I said, "You're lying." And she exploded.
Yeah.
And I get it now. This is one of my now teaching stories. That was too much, too heavy, and I couldn't repair it. And I watched her face fall, and I was like, oh, no. And I said, I am so sorry. Like, this was not my first mess up in a session, so, like, I had a repertoire of apologizing.
Right.
Right. I am
a really good repertoire to have.
Yeah, right. Well, because especially when you're genuine and you're trying things like, how was it?
I don't mean to be caught up in the story. What happened, Glenn?
Yeah, she bailed.
Okay.
She left treatment.
So I tried it, and I even felt okay about the apology, right? Which isn't really what matters. But I felt like I had tried to really clean it up, and I'm so sorry. That was too much. What I should have said was, and how is and then it becomes this opportunity. Like, the biggest interpersonal behavior opportunity is, we're struggling. What can we do? If I laid this out, sort of lay down the sword for you, will you pick it up? Can we be okay? Slowing it all down. This is an important skill to have. All relationships have problems. Blah, blah. Right? So she came back the next session and she was done. I hurt her so bad. And it took me a while then to get over that I was that shitty to another human, to the point now where how I conceptualize it is, that was a blunder. I tried to create an opportunity to fix that in a person who couldn't really she didn't have a repertoire to show up to that ability to fix it. Like, I was the guy she trusted and did that. And so I feel badly about it, and I did what I could have done for having made a mistake. There are much bigger mistakes we can make with clients. And I've made some and been able to mend. Not bigger necessarily, but definitely like that level of, how could you say that to me? How could you be that uncaring to me?
Have you ever had the experience where you make a huge blunder and you think it's repaired, and you find out many sessions later
they're still upset?
Or it fundamentally changed something in the relationship for them.
Yep.
And there's no matter what you do, no matter how much Yeah.
Could I share an
example? Stimulus function, it absolutely changes for them.
I was just way too liberally using, as I refer to it now, the C word, choice, working with somebody who was, and this is somebody a client I really liked.
Yeah.
Somebody I really felt for. This is the type of person where I'm telling you, if I had met them outside of therapy, we would be fast friends. You know what I mean? We'd be buddies, and struggling with some really impulsive behavior, some binge eating behavior. And I just totally insensitively using the C word, as I call it, choice, right? Talking about choice. And I think I was just moving too quick, and I didn't catch myself saying it. And I don't think they felt, they weren't able to go there in the session and let me know that that was kind of cutting them, and they couldn't let me know.
I want to speak to something here really quick, really quick. Because Glenn, this is exactly what you're talking about, is that idiographic analysis. Words don't mean the same things to people.
Yeah.
Well, and I think in the case of
I'm sorry, Tim, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just
no, well, and so I just wanted to very clearly say that was, I wasn't able to track, like Glenn's giving us these beautiful examples of doing functional analysis in the moment, which is pretty rock and roll, right? Like live in the session with the client, noticing the look on their face. And this word floated by. I had no sense of it, how pervasive this word would be. And it wasn't until a later session where it had come out that my liberal application of that word was really harmful to this person.
Yeah.
What a cool opportunity though, right? So for the client to bring it back around, like where you can say like, I'm so sorry, genuinely. Because I think that's an easy place. I think it's hard for a therapist to sometimes be not correct. Like I get that, like we're the professional or whatever, but like your job is to help a human, which means you care about humans. So when you do something stupid, it's super easy to say sorry. Right? That just don't even get hung up on that kind of thing. I'm not saying you were, Tim, or anything, but this is like the easiest part of this work. And what a cool opportunity to say, I'm so sorry that I did that. I didn't know. That's useful for us to chat about. And so I want to set that right here and say, let's come back to this idea of like choice being a really triggering word for you. I really want to talk about how you didn't tell me that. And this is, you're not in trouble. But I want to talk about what's allowing you to tell me now.
Oh, yeah.
And I want to also talk about if this happens again, could we do it differently?
Yeah.
Right? Because you think about all these different...
Or when it happens again.
Right.
When.
And it won't be the word choice. It'll be something else. Right? Because if we're this connected, we will have conflict. I think. Yeah. There's... What I'm noticing in the conversation, which I'm super digging, what I'm noticing is there's so much to talk about in all this, like, and everything's in the details, right? It's, how do you teach? How do you get people to understand how to do interpersonal work that isn't just one giant bucket of details, right? It's very complex. This organizing frame that I have around these 5 different repertoires is super useful for me, but I don't think it's useful.
Can you repeat those 5 different repertoires again?
Right. So for me, they're assertion of identification and assertion of needs or values. Values are just, identified reinforcers. There's the communication that we have between the two of us where I give you feedback, you give me feedback, and I respond to that. Right. So I need to be able to identify that and respond effectively to it. And that's a rich repertoire all by itself, right? Because you might say something I don't like and then I don't want to talk to you anymore. The third repertoire for me is conflict, right? So there's always going to be conflict that can range from just being slightly put off to really big. The fourth repertoire is probably the richest one, which is how do I disclose or share stuff that matters? And how do I respond to you when you do it? In a caring, empathic way. And identify opportunities. All of this is identifying opportunities with whom, where, when to do it, right? Because you don't do that on an elevator. Most of us don't, right? But there are places to disclose. And the last one is just the kind of acceptance repertoire of how do I identify and respond to my own emotional experience.
Are we speaking about the stuff that there's 2 different acronyms and I'm going to mess them up. Is this like the FIAT stuff?
It's the FIAT itself, but...
The FIAT itself, for sure. So can you talk a little bit to the people about what the FIAT is besides the car?
Yeah.
Right. So when we made the acronym, FIAT didn't exist in the U.S. anymore. So I thought it's funny because I grew up, in the 70s and that's a terrible car.
Yes.
Now it turns out
it's really hip and cool. So there you go.
It's a super powerful company. So much for humor. And so So we, a bunch of us were trying to come up with ways to identify kind of a structural assessment, or at least classification, like to name, nomenclature, for the multiple repertoires we go after in FAP, or interpersonal behavior therapy. And Nevada came up with their own. It's not super dissimilar. And then I came up with this one, and basically the functional idiographic assessment template, so FIAT, is identifying these 5 repertoires. It's very behavioral, not popular. Identifying these main repertoires that would help us move through thinking about client issues. And in the manual itself, it says, these are questions you can ask, and here's a way to ask them, and so on. So that you end up with 4 or 5 targets that we could have similar language for.
So I want to pause for a second here, because I'm absolutely sure that people listening to this podcast are going to want to have access to that.
And so they're going to be in the show notes.
Oh, cool. So and Tim, I can send this to you, or Joanne. So on my university website, so if you typed in Glenn Callaghan, extra N and a bonus G in Callaghan, and we'll have that up, and SJSU, you get to my page, and there's some goofy picture of me. And then at the very top bar, and we'll give the direct link, there will be a link for information about the FIAT, and it's up there for free. Like, this is all, give it away, right? Hopefully it's useful. It's undergoing a revision that is brilliant by these folks in Brazil, right? So this is what I waited for. This is out of Claudia Ashiro's lab, and I'm not going to remember.
That's okay. That's okay. I just wanted to
Daniel and some of the other folks. They're so smart, right? And so the hope with the FIAT was to put something out there, knowing like this ain't it, but someone smarter is going to run with this. This was the hope. This is like 10 years ago. And so some of these folks out of Brazil, one of the people in particular said, I think this is what it was missing. And he said it so kindly. I got to go down there and visit. And he said, have you thought about, I'm not saying it's not good. I'm like, that's it. And what it was is it kicked open not only the repertoire that was missing, which is the anticipated community response to the repertoire that you're building.
Oh, wow.
You're genius, right?
Interesting.
And I couldn't figure out the C and the ABC of this. I could just figure out the antecedents and behaviors, figure the consequences are what they are. The repertoire wouldn't be in play, and I can't name all those reinforcers. And he's like, but you could name this. I'm like, yes. And then once we started revising it, it's taking a slightly different shape in a really, really cool way. Yeah, so it would be moving a lot faster if I weren't lazy. Anyway, so the FIAT is, and it may have a different name. I think it might still be called FIAT, but FAP's going to drop out and just a broader thing. So basically organizing thoughts around these main repertoires, so that when we're talking about these complex cases, like, a person getting upset that you're using the word choice, like, good Lord, me calling someone a liar, totally get that. Like, choice, like, wow, I'm not sure I could have seen that coming. And let's talk about the conflict that's emerged. And can you identify that this is a space to talk about your discomfort, and that you may have an emotional experience that's difficult. So these are all non-orthogonal, right? They're all happening at the same time. And could you notice that and even tell me, if you didn't want to talk about the content, you said something that was really upsetting, it's hard for me to be here. Like, that would be huge. Imagine them doing that in their life. Like, right now, it's just hard to stay in this moment. I think this is Gottman stuff. I feel triggered, or whatever. I need space. And so, like, these repertoires, to be able to see them as they're happening, like seeing the matrix, like see them as they're happening, not the act matrix, sorry.
Not the what matrix?
Act matrix. I'm thinking of the goofy movie.
I was pretty sure that was not the one you were talking about.
Like you see the code, right?
Right, the code, exactly.
And so to be able to have a frame to think about, there are complex issues happening. What is my job? I think it's really helpful for me to have a structure that boils it down. I can only hold 3 or 4 things in my head at once anyway. And so this is not to sell the FIAT. It is free. It is hopefully going to be a slightly more usable version. But for people to think about, if I'm going to do this interpersonal work, I need a way to frame this because there is tons happening at once.
Right. So I want to, I'm glad you came back to that, because I think that's a really important thing. People can get lost in the detail. They get caught up in the topography.
Yeah.
And they can't see function. They can't see that there's ways a person does these things.
Well, and these are all epistemic barriers, right? These are ways we just don't, this is so different than what we were taught.
Oh God, yeah.
And in therapy, like, I think we come in knowing what we would want to, like, you know, you ask an undergraduate, is crying in therapy good or bad? And it's the rare undergraduate who would say it could be either, right? No, it's good. No, but it's not always good. In fact, lots of times it's not good.
No.
And it's not that you would punish it, but it's super not the repertoire that you're looking for. Anyway, because we don't think function.
No, we don't.
And so teaching this idea of topography, and this is fundamental, I think it's fundamental to ACT, but for sure it is in this interpersonal work. Can you develop an ability to recognize that I could do 3 or 4 different things that all bought me the same thing, all got me down the line in the same way? And
but look completely different from the outside.
But look completely different.
And can you imagine that I can be doing the exact same thing from the outside, but internally it's completely different?
Right. Right. So I think for me, how exciting. I think for a lot of people, like, what? You know, it's like, and not that they're stupid, but like, that's too complicated. Being in the room is hard enough.
I'm not so sure it's complicated, Glenn. I think it's that you have to do this work effectively, you literally have to transform how you perceive reality.
Right.
And I think if you can't make that shift, it's really difficult to do this kind of work. I would say it's probably impossible.
I think you
have to be able to see the code.
Yeah, to do this stuff well. Yes. You know, and there's other therapies, like, what is it? It's one of the dynamic therapies by Hannah Levinson and Drop.
I know which one you're talking about, but I can't think of the name of it.
Yeah, can't remember either. I'm pretty sure they're doing what we're doing. They have a really different story, and it's got a real cognitive bent. Although they would say it's dynamic. Like, no, I get that you're going into, you know, cyclic maladaptive patterns, and you're saying are childhood based, but so did Beck, and the intervention you're doing is cognitive. But what they're looking for is live in session. And so they've got a framework. My guess is it's just a little bit easier to get your head around because we're born into thinking people are driven by their own, you know, early childhood attachment and stuff. It's not that attachment's not important. It's just not that. It's not the only thing.
Which is revelatory and staggering for many therapists to consider that.
Fundamentally functional, right? Like, of course, it's not necessarily everything because it depends on the person, right? It's almost like if you started that, if we're going to top down this, function is, it depends on the person. And wouldn't want your client.
It depends on the person and the context.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So they're not only their history, but their current context, sort of,
and their imagined future context.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's interesting. I got to put that aside. I'm going to go after that. Like, that's good. That's shiny.
It's funny. It's funny how this is playing out, though, because before I had made my way to ACT and FAP and really being influenced by those early FAP publications, I mean, my training was in psychodynamic work. And it's funny now because when you mention like the Hannah Levinson stuff, like the brief dynamic work, I'm totally thinking like, they're just trying to create a topographical description of, you know, a technology description, if you will, of you know, doing present moment work with the client, really functional work.
That's it. And that's the beauty in what they do. And the reality is, I think, you know, the FIAT is a quasi-functional system. Ultimately, it's going to name things. And the the idea is that you would try to get a sense of function. But nailing this down in complex repertoires ultimately is going to have some topography in it. I think this is getting really esoteric. I think like there's not really a way around that.
So I want to talk about something else, about how you can teach and learn this this approach, this way of doing the work, a way of being. And my suggestion, my thinking is the only way you can learn how to do interpersonal behavioral therapy is in an interpersonal relationship over time. It's not going to be able to be taught in a 2-day workshop.
Right. The best we could do is expose people to the sort of richness of what this could be, right? And the challenge in a 2-day workshop, I think even a 3-hour workshop,
absolutely,
that you give them just enough to be horribly dangerous.
Yeah.
And ACT had this super early on. So I should say, like, I'm 25 years into this game at this point, which is super weird because I still feel somewhere around 14. Just a kind of bigger vocabulary. In some
Maybe
ways.
not.
Yeah, I was going to say, just strike the last comment is stricken from the record. And I think, the challenge of some of the ACT workshops I would go to is you'd wind these people up with these really intensely powerful skills and they go wield them on people and you realize
like I did with that guy, like I did with my client. Right. I was doing diffusion. I was using humor as I think I was using the Donald Duck thing.
Yeah.
And
without realizing how powerful this is. And the challenge then that we should definitely talk about for a few is if we're creating this really intense kind of interpersonal connection where we want the client to experience vulnerability in the service of being able to, I would argue, disclose more real feelings. Doesn't even have to be history. And to then reciprocate. With therapy, that's challenging, right? Because we don't disclose history, but outside in the world, to reciprocate by asking the other person to engage in more connecting disclosure and assert what they need. That if we're doing that with clients, it really is one of the most, and we're in the room quite real, one of the biggest opportunities for behaving unethically. Right. And so we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I do want to say, how would you teach this when you asked? You would expose people to the power of being able to not just do something like challenge a cognition or rewrite, a narrative of your past or be able to sit with difficult feelings, but do that in the presence of others, right? So when I teach this, I might have told you this, Joanne, now my slides actually start with a few slides about the evolution of humans, and we split off 7 million years ago. And both species that came out of this, and arguably the gorilla line, but the chimpanzee line especially, we are 1.5% genetically different. We both fundamentally need connection.
Yeah.
We need social, that is what allowed the chimps and us to survive. And arguably, especially as the humans evolved, super useful to have a skill to deal with the bullshit that rose up on top of the very, very bizarrely evolved brain case. And so great stuff for ACT and then the stuff for us. So when we teach, here's what's really missing from a lot of our therapies is just not only profound empathy, but empathy in the service of how can you be with another person and get what you need, right?
And that's for the therapist and the client at the same time.
Right.
The risks that we are asking the client to take, we are stepping first.
Absolutely.
We are stepping into that risky area first and inviting them to join us. We're not standing to the side and describing it and going, "Come on over there. It's over there."
Right.
And I think that that's the piece that's, when we're talking about boundary violations, I think that's the piece. If you don't have good people you can talk to about the intensity of these experiences, you can get really weird.
I think you get weird and isolated, and I think you sometimes get confused.
Yeah.
About what intimacy entails.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah.
The sort of the whole ethical principle of not exploiting clients, right? It's just, it has to be the top of our list. And the challenge of this work, and again, not that there aren't other therapies that can't do this, but what I've seen in FAP, the challenge is that we're creating such vulnerability and such intensity that the natural conclusion that people draw from that is, I must be in love.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we do when we're in love?
Mm-hmm.
We hook up.
Yeah, we hook up.
Yeah. And this is partly why. So one of my massive pushbacks against FAP is the use of the word love.
Mm-hmm.
It was from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not the word to choose. Compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Great. You don't see Buddhists hooking up with everybody, right?
Yeah. Well, kind of you do, because there's a lot going on in the Me Too movement in the Buddhist community. So
is that true?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Sorry, it's not funny. So
it kind of is. In this context, it's funny.
What I was thinking of is, like, you don't see, you don't go to like a sangha and everybody's hitting on each other after a really good meditation.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's kind of what I was thinking of. And so compassion, but the use of the word love for many of us connotes
You're talking about the awareness, courage, and love
right.
model. Okay.
No problem with awareness. It's discrimination. You call it awareness, as long as we're clear that this isn't, sort of a metaphysical awareness for the psychotherapy. That's fine. You can have metaphysical awareness somewhere else. Courage. I use bravery all the time with clients, right? Yeah. What would it take for you to show up to this? This is going to take a lot of courage. Brave, totally fine. It's just, it's an augmental, probably, if I'm using the term right. At the very least, it's transfer of function.
Mm-hmm.
Love, though, right out, right? Because so this is how it was taught to me, and I think this is true, this is how I teach, is if I'm in a relationship and I find myself disclosing and you're super cool with me, and I can even tell you the most messed up stuff in my head, and you're still super cool with me,
mm-hmm.
and I feel warm around you,
mm-hmm. and I can't wait to see you again.
I can't wait to see you again because you are so kind.
There it is.
That is love. That is what we seek in I would imagine many of us in our partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so how would I not summarize that in psychotherapy as I love my therapist, right?
Yeah, of course.
And
that's
people
very logical and rational.
And they do. And
reasonably so.
Yeah, I believe that what we do is an act of that thing they're calling love.
Right.
Of what people would call, I think, but the word I would not use is love. What the word I would use is we have full hearts with tremendous compassion.
Mm-hmm.
But it's agape love, right? And it's not eros. And the problem is that when I confuse that, if I say I must love my therapist, that when I confuse that, what comes in is erotic feelings.
Of course.
And without thinking about it, I'm going to move on that as a client. So clients are going to do this. The reality is therapists move on clients too. But this is the easier piece of the two, quite honestly, is you should anticipate this is what's going to happen for some clients, because they're going to react to a strong feeling they've identified this way with a repertoire they know.
I want to pause for a second here, because my experience is it can be eroticized, but it also can be you are my mommy.
Really?
Oh
yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying.
That sense of you are my person. You are, you are my primary person, client, therapist, and that struggle. And I think it's important to just have a direct conversation about it. I am your only therapist. You are not my only client.
Yeah.
And that kind of that happens for someone when they have to kind of wrap their head around that. And it's being very respectful of the deep sort of, for want of a better word, attachment and love that the client feels, but also not lying about it, not saying, and you are the most important person in my life too.
Not fetishizing it. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And I would also argue, just from a perspective of somebody who has been sort of, who went from reading the FAP stuff on a technical level and being like, this is so cool, and then going to a workshop on awareness, courage, and love as a professional, and kind of looking around, and I truly mean this with respect, but perpetrating that on young clinicians, this idea, because how confusing could that be then? Like, we're supposed to ourselves, if we're being aware of CRBs, these clinically relevant behaviors in our clients, that we're supposed to be aware of, like, our T1s and our T2s, right? Our clinically relevant behaviors as client or therapists. Okay. And so here we're supposed to have awareness of client behavior. We're supposed to have courage in session and love. damn, how confusing is that for therapists that we're training in this too, right? Because could I start to imagine, well, I must be in love with this client.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And so again, like fun conversations to have with students academically are, the commandment was given on the third tablet, thou shalt not shag a client. Okay? And we're all in agreement. Right?
That is your next Christmas gift from me there, Glenn.
Right? That'd be awesome. Right? So
Moses
got 3 is like, this one's for you guys. The other 2 is for everybody.
Yeah.
And so we all say, okay. And then the most interesting question academically is, why would you want to?
Yeah.
And so the complex question then, becomes like, Tim, what you're saying is, so then I'm in this room and I'm having feelings of vulnerability and connection. And there are clients we would be buddies with. One of my hardest clients was someone, and it took a really thoughtful clinician to tell me a couple sessions and like, why is this hard? Why do we keep getting off topic? And he was saying the smartest shit I'd ever heard.
Oh yeah.
And she said, because you would be friends with him. And I was like, huh, right? This is early on in training. And so we would be friends, and then sometimes we would find them attractive.
Yeah.
Right? Because we all have things we're attracted to, right?
Yeah.
Types, people, whatever it is.
And we also may be in a position in our lives where we are vulnerable to be attracted.
That's it. And so what if I'm lonely?
Yeah. What if my marriage isn't going so well?
Right. Yep. And here's this person who says that I am the shit.
The shit. Right. I cannot wait to see me.
And I'm attracted to him or whatever.
Right.
Like, how would that not be the most? And you're talking about feelings. Not even you're talking around stuff. Like you're talking about the brother-in-law for 2 hours. Like you are talking about you guys. Yeah. Like when you say
you're talking to your client about things that you wouldn't talk about in that way to your spouse. At that level,
right.
At that level of, just like no holds barred.
Right. Real feelings in the
real
room.
Feelings, right?
So the line generally, I think, with FAP gets drawn that you disclose feelings, not past. But the reality is, some of us, and I've done this, have introduced content before. I have disclosed content with a few clients. Very, I would argue, decisively, but it feels risky, right? Because now therapy is not the disclosing of my experience. In the room it can be, but not my history. Right? Does that make sense? So of course it's ripe for this. And you go to these workshops and they're incredibly evocative. And I think someone has decided that is what sells psychotherapy. ACT is rife with this historically, right? So we do these insanely weird exercises that don't map onto reality. I'm a huge fan of it. I want to be clear.
For example.
Yeah. Super big fan. But there are some activities I've done where I'm like, I'm not sure why I'm doing this. But, I'm a naysayer or whatever on some of that stuff. Anyway, FAP stuff, though, gets really risky because, tell this person across from you something you've never told anybody else. Like, no. The discrimination there is no, because I don't know you. Now, Joanne, if I'm sitting with you and you said, this is the activity, I'd say, all right, I trust you actually an enormous amount.
And we have a relationship too.
We have a relationship where
we have tested back and forth over many years.
Really meaningful stuff, right? I have cried with you. And so like, I would say, can we talk about how I'm scared to do something like that with you? But Tim, and you seem awesome, since I don't know you, I would say, Tim, I don't know you well enough to tell you something that I don't tell other humans, right? And so that would actually be, I would argue, for many of us, including clients, the right discrimination. Yes. And in fact, a boundaryless discrimination is to say, Tim, I don't know you, so I'm going to pull something out of my history that actually would be better left unsaid, probably in most spaces. Like that is so risky to me.
Right. Yeah.
Not that vulnerability and practicing ways for us to experience what would it be like for me to show up to you as a human and not as a therapist, as sort of more of a, as a therapist, I say, oh, that must have been hard for you. And what would it be like if I really connected with the affect that was in that moment? Right? So this is an exercise I do when I do trainings. It is to ask, okay, the next time you guys do this interaction, I want you to show up, and instead of go after the content of what they said, I want you to really think about how it felt to be in the room with something sharing, whether it was happy or sad.
Can I share something with you too here? I came out of the psychoanalytic tradition. Before I found ACT, I was going to do the whole hardcore psychoanalytic training. And so I used to go to these consultation meetings. And one of the things I think the analysts did is they talk about this openly, richly, constantly. So I went to a consultation, and there was a senior analyst talking about exactly this in a room full of maybe 8-10 people. That it wasn't like we'd been together for a while, and the people in the room are nodding and saying, there's a whole conversation that's open in that community about this exactly, that we do not have in the CBT or the behavioral community. It's not here.
Which conversation specifically?
They're talking about this kind of depth and rich and riskiness and boundary violations and what does it mean, and the countertransference. It's the name. There's words for it even.
Right.
Well, we don't have that.
If I may, I liken this a lot to, the role that journalists need to play, like politically, right? Like we need a cantankerous, cynical media that can really do some reality checks. I brought a friend of mine who's cynical, a colleague, to a FAP training. And we were about a quarter of the way into the training, and I was like, what do you think of this? And they're like, I think this is real creepy.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
The interesting thing about that, Tim, is so I felt like that was my job for a while.
Yeah.
For probably about 8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
And what I found was, because I had historically been so invested in the success of that psychotherapy, that it was just incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
And actually, you don't get invited to the parties. I think if you had someone fully outside, they could do it. The problem is people like Lilienfeld and some of the critics out there just come off kind of like buttheads. And you're like, well, you don't know, because you're not in the game.
Yeah.
And so I totally agree with what you're saying. And unless we're all willing to do it to some extent, I think it's like we have to police ourselves. Like when someone says something goofy or you hear about a bad workshop, like we need to talk openly about this.
Yeah, we don't.
Not just the guy who's...
Why don't we, do you think?
Do this.
Like, what is this?
I would say to you that there isn't a sort of community, cultural acceptance of it the way there is in the analytic community. It is it's a deal, it's a thing. It's something that is part of the conversation regularly. And for us, it's sort of an aberration.
Yeah.
Rather than of course this is going to show up.
I think
Let's talk about how it shows up. Let's talk about what to do when it shows up. Let's talk about the kind of ways therapists can be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really important. Now we can take out all the analytic shaming bit about, all that part, the defective.
And that it's not neurosis.
And it's not neurosis. It's not unfinished business. There's not,
Yeah. Right. You have a repertoire to work on. I think you're right, Joanne, that this is the rare therapy that's been brought into a community that hasn't had that focus.
Exactly. And there's no structure. After you go to these intense, come to Jesus trainings, ACT, FAP, whatever, there's no place to go where you can actually, like the analytic community, sit down and talk about it and say, wow, what's this? I'm thinking I'm getting a little funky here. In a safe environment.
Right.
I cannot tell you how many consultees that I've had that I have to work through them telling me what they think I want to hear. Right?
Ouch.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we can get to what they need to talk about.
Right.
Because they have been so shamed for stuff that therapists, we can't help it. It's going to show up. We're humans. We're chimpanzees, for crying out loud.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right? Sorry, I kind of went off on a rant there.
But I think this is key. And it's actually something I was really hoping we would talk about. Like, I'm so excited about, like, how could you get people to do this interpersonal work, or at least augment some beautiful therapies like ACT and CBT, and even good CBT.
Yes.
Can use this. I think Jonathan Kanner wrote a great paper on behavioral activation saying, don't forget this piece. There's interpersonal stuff happening.
Yeah.
And I think I like to talk about that a lot because I'm excited about it intellectually. I'm excited about the stuff that happens in the room. But the bigger context that you're talking about is, how do we have a community that can call out weirdness or say, it's okay that this feels funky? Or when you're teaching this interpersonal work, just so you know, when you start developing this repertoire with clients, it's going to go into your real life and relationships are going to shift because of what you're working on. Because it's not enough to be a therapist in the room with a skill set. Like, I think a good ACT therapist is practicing ACT outside of the room. Like, that's a good ACT therapist. And so a good, whether FAP or interpersonal behavior therapist, is trying to do those things outside of the room too.
Yeah.
And that's hard, and it's disruptive sometimes. And I think having a space to be able to do that is going to be fundamental. I think the focused piece that has to happen with FAP right now is there are unethical things happening. There are people who are at least being accused of violating major boundaries, some of which are sexual, with clients, that has to be stopped and responded to absolutely publicly. Or FAP's dead on the vine. I have no doubt. But the problem is it will leach into ACBS. That ACBS is a place that allows that to happen, which it isn't. I know the players. I know the original organizers. Like, these are highly ethical human beings. At least a couple that I'm thinking of, the 3 or 4 real hardcore ACBS organizers. Historically. And so, but it would require calling that out, and it's going to be disruptive, but fundamentally important, because I think my biggest worry, and one of the reasons I've sort of broke from FAP all the way, but still do the interpersonal work, and am trying to see it like, there's a huge umbrella, and one way to do this stuff is FAP, but the problem is the way it's taught and what's going on, and is like, in fact, you shouldn't be doing that, in my opinion.
Yes.
But hopefully, probably, if other people are listening to this, is you wouldn't do that. You don't do unethical FAP. Let's just have that be the version we're not doing. And if you want to call it CRBs and awareness, courage, and love, do that. It's mid-level stuff. If you want to do it more behavior analytically, do that. That's kind of the interpersonal behavior therapy stuff.
But remember that third tablet.
Right.
Thou shalt not shag thy clients in any way, shape, or form.
In any way, thou shalt. Yes, that's what it would say. Thou shalt not exploit the client, and getting your needs met with the client counts as exploitative. And so I think having that conversation is so important, or it will absolutely ruin this. And so the next iteration of what's missing in ACBS is interpersonal work. That is what is missing. There are only like 3 or 4 people that ever talk about this each year. We can't.
At the conferences, you mean?
At the conferences, sorry. We can't have that be the outcome. And so, where we lose the interpersonal bit because it went all wonky. Right? So instead, let's sort of call out what's not working, make sure we're clear on the directions that, maybe there's 2 paths that this is going down, and that it's highly, highly ethical. Yeah, I don't mean to sound overly preachy about that, but this is
I absolutely agree. I agree. I think this is something that is fundamentally, subtle, and I think it's such a big part. This exploitation it's such a big part of what goes on with humans now. Well, always anyway. That of course we need to say not if it happens,
right,
but of course this is part and parcel of what can show up, and often does.
Right.
If it does for you, what will you do? And here's what you can do. Yes. But I think that sense of like, well, if it shows up, no.
Yeah, it has to show up. And what's nice,
it does show up.
Start having a broader conversation, like your repertoire is in the room in therapies like this.
Your relational history is also in the room.
That's it. And so we can focus on, and rightly so, sexually inappropriate behavior. But notice there's a variety of ways we can respond ineffectively. Like we talked about humor. I remember one time with a client, this is very early on in my training, but I would argue I could have been 10 years in and still would have failed to respond effectively. But this guy came in, he was tough. He had 2 murders under his belt, 1 intentional. The second one he came to therapy for was accidental. It was manslaughter. He hit someone who came out in front of him in a car.
Mm-hmm.
Bad things happen. He was very, very upset about it. This was the focus therapy. Huge repertoire issues, though. And he had tremendous anger. And so he's sitting across from me in a session, and he starts pounding the arms of his chair. And I shut down.
Mm-hmm.
Just completely shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a good hour or so and some supervision for me to realize that's way too much of my childhood history in the room at once,
Mm-hmm.
with no ability to see it coming
Mm-hmm.
or to know how to respond when it did. I didn't leave, which was good.
Physically.
Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, checked out. Didn't leave physically.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm going to still give myself a pat for that one.
Yeah.
Right.
And
You didn't.
so, yeah. And so.
But I want to pause for a second here because I want to speak to what you just said.
Yeah.
You had this experience, and then you said, and I went to supervision.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously was a supervisory relationship where that kind of honesty and openness was celebrated and wanted. I would suggest to you that is incredibly vanishingly rare.
Yes.
Yeah, that is the worry, especially around these complex treatments. Like, this stuff takes ongoing conversations.
It does.
And it's incredibly complicated, right? Because I want to be one of the people who has ongoing conversations, but the reality is, like, my time has value now.
Yeah.
And there's only so much to spread around, which means for you to get better at this and to make sure you're not doing goofy stuff and to have a really open conversation about what's hard about the work, it's going to cost you money.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is so difficult, right? It's almost like, I imagine there's a parallel where you tell a client, like, okay, our work is done, but I'm going to need you to come back in for a follow-up because that's how I like to really make sure things are working. But that's going to cost you money. So they're going to come in for a follow-up.
Right.
Agencies don't support that.
Right.
And so to have people learn some of these skills and say, well, I'm sure when you go out and you'll be fine. Like, well, that's not going to be true.
No.
So you need supervision. So this is going to cost you even more money.
Yeah. And a lot of clinicians are not rolling in the dough.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
one of the things that Tim and I'd hope for is these podcasts would have some of that.
Yes.
That we were talking at this level so people could go, oh.
Right.
You know?
Well, and
out in the world. Right.
I would
I
love
agree with you. I've been in that position many, many times. Like, Joanne, I want to do follow-up. How, I'm like, okay, well, this is my consultation fee.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Radio silence.
Yeah.
Well, and which makes sense, right? And so the interesting kind of conversation maybe that this would spur is how do we sort of negotiate that tension between we want people to have, ongoing consultation or supervision around complex skill sets.
Yes.
That doesn't have to be for everything.
No.
But it's going to come at a response cost, at a financial cost to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it keeps them ethical. But we only have so much money to go around, right? So I think that's the conversation to have. It's almost like if I were in charge, which no one has voted me yet, and I'm super surprised about that.
We're still
I like
it happen.
But if I got to be in charge and really redesigned all this and said, okay, I'm going to invent this therapy. And I'm realizing DBT actually has some of this. I don't know if it's practiced this way, but Marsha's version.
The consultation team, absolutely.
Was
very much a part of it. Yeah.
Exactly.
I was just thinking the same thing.
Yeah. So I would steal Marsha's stuff.
As one does.
I would say, if you're going to do this work, you are committed to the following.
Right.
And it would include a version of CEs for interpersonal work.
Right.
You don't get to just do this. Yeah, and it may be I'm trying to think back, 15 years ago when we started having these conversations, and I threatened, I don't want to do this work anymore. I'm going to do my own thing. They're like, don't do that.
Yeah.
With FAP. And I'm thinking back on those conversations, as I think about this, well, this just wouldn't sell.
No.
So maybe it would.
Unless, I think in the DBT community, my experience of it is there's an open acknowledgement about how difficult the population is and how wacky you can get as a therapist.
That's right.
Therapist interfering therapy behavior. It's very, very, it's just fundamentally part of the conversation.
Yeah.
You know? We don't have that in our community same way. We just don't.
So Marcia Linehan has been really open publicly about how wacky she had been in the past. It's awesome. It's like one of the biggest most amazing moves I've ever seen. Like it's New York Times Magazine or something. Like, holy crap. So amazing and so transparent. I wonder if and this is making assumptions because I'm a huge fan of what DBT brought to the field. Mm-hmm. And I think many of us in ACBS probably use some of her stuff, whether we acknowledge it or not. Like you get someone who's affectively dysregulated, we're doing her stuff. I don't use all the acronyms because I can't ever remember that stuff. I can't remember the 5 rules of FAP. And so I wonder if I'm presupposing that Marcia had a self-awareness of her struggles and said, humans are going to struggle with this. They're required to do this. And that if FAP had grown up with that it would have required that. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, it's presupposing.
I absolutely do. Right.
But, I don't even know if I would have had the self-awareness. I mean, the guy who trained me, Bill Follett, was so smart and so compassionate and so amazing and just knew me. That he would be able to sit across and say, like, this is where you're messing up. You know, I don't understand why this client doesn't like it. You don't like her. Oh, I like them all. You know, and like, no, you don't have to. And so cut that, you know. And so.
But in that relationship with Bill, you had the safety to hear that from him.
Well, and I wonder if because of that, if I had been the one to create this, I would have been able to say, look, you're going to mess this up a bunch of places. You need ongoing consultation. It's going to make you a different person, which is great. You're going to be more vulnerable and connected, but you can't do this on your own. Like, I wonder if I would have had that self-awareness. I don't know if I would have, but I do wish FAP had what DBT had. It sounds like where I'm sort of imposing this on Marcia that she just knew, either out of a self-awareness or just the work with that population that it started with.
Yes.
You need help.
Yeah.
You need talk about your own stuff, about what's going on with your clients. You don't get to just be out there on your own. That I think like FAP would have really, really benefited from that.
I think ACT too.
Yeah, you think
absolutely.
So?
I don't even think it's too late, really.
No.
Yeah.
So, and maybe this is a good place for us to kind of pause and start to wrap up the conversation, because my hope is for our listeners that you have found this conversation to be useful. And I know that this can be a really difficult topic. And so I'd like to invite you, if you're noticing difficult things showing up inside of you around the conversation that the three of us are having on this, I would welcome you to write into us and have a conversation and open that dialogue, especially if there's things that we could read on the podcast. And maybe, Glenn, it would be really cool if you'd be willing to come back and have a follow-up conversation about this. And maybe even the three of us could make some commitments as a group to start just spreading this more within even the ACBS community.
Oh, I'd be stoked. I mean, I love talking to the two of you guys for sure. Like this is all.
I love talking to you.
Warren,
if I get you actually committed to something, I can make sure that you'll show up.
I think it's a disorder. I have some kind of disorder. It's not.
Yeah, I think
I'm trying to name all of mine. But yeah, no, I think the commitment to doing that openly.
Wait. One more thing, Tim, because we need to give them the email address so they can do that.
That's right. So it's actincontextpodcast@gmail.com.
Right. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you.
And that, of course, will be available in the show notes along with the FIAT cue.
Right.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And well, there's also, and again, I don't want to sell this because it's free. There is a version of the FIAT for therapists to identify your own repertoire challenges. And it runs in parallel. Cool. Yeah, but it's tailored to us. Yeah. But it requires a willingness to look at it. I make when I teach this stuff, I make the people I teach do it. But it points out things you ain't always looking to see. It's called the FACET, so Functional Assessment of Skills for Interpersonal Therapists. We had tried to call it the FARTS because I just thought that would be the funniest thing ever, which is Functional Assessment for Required Therapist Skills. I thought it was a stroke of genius to come up with that. Apparently not so publishable. Anyway, so, but we could put that up too, because I think really one of the main issues is who are we in the room and what's going to show up for us? Where is it going to get difficult? Where would you want to get supervision? I think talking about this stuff more publicly at ACBS would be absolutely delightful. I think having like a really open panel on these issues would be phenomenal.
Are you going to go to Dublin?
Oh yeah. And I would show up to the conference to do this. Otherwise, I may put in.
How about you? Would you?
Yeah.
Maybe?
Yeah. Yeah, I would.
Let's talk about it. Let's see if we can grab some other people in on this conversation too.
Well, I would just love for if people are listening or watching and say, they'd want to be part of that conversation. Like those are the most interesting panels, is to have people talking, not just the people sitting at the table, people who have attended.
We were on one of those panels together, you and I. It was fun.
Where was it at? In Seattle?
Probably Seattle, yeah.
Yeah. I think I'm now ready to light it up. I think if it was Seattle, I was still mildly on chemo. But I'm at the point now where things have moved far enough that we just need to be really, really open. I don't want to be the poopy guy in the room, but I don't want to say things that are alienating. Partly it costs me personally, but the other is that's not really how I construct myself. But the reality is okay, so something has to change. Like you're saying, Tim, it's not too late to have conversations about maybe part of the training needs to be this. Then if it's not too late, then we should be having.
And also there needs to be a place for people who have crossed the line to step back in.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there isn't at this point. So people who have crossed the line aren't going to say anything about it.
Right.
They're going to keep the secret.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which is hugely problematic.
Yeah.
This inspires so much hope in me that we can do something really useful to the community and spread this in a useful way.
Cool.
Glenn, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. This has been a really great conversation, and promise me you're going to come back.
Oh, I would love to. And thank you so much, both of you, for asking. This is delightful.
This was great.
This is great. Take care, my dear. I'm so happy.
For our listeners, don't forget, if you're listening on a podcast, you can check the show notes on however you consume the podcast. So whether it's your podcasting app, we will definitely have links to the FIAT queue, as well as to the
farts.
I hoped it was called the farts,
the therapist version.
This is your opportunity to have it named the way you want it to, Glenn.
That's right. Our email address will be there as well. And definitely, don't forget, you can consume the podcast as a video podcast on YouTube. So definitely search for the Act in Context podcast if you'd like to watch. And definitely send us in an email or a tweet. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much, Joanne and Glenn. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, Glenn.